This morning's first reading is from the book of Proverbs, chapter 31, verses 10 to 12 and 27 to 31. The I'm quite sure male author writes, "A woman of strength who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. She looks well to the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her happy. Her husband too, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her a share in the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the city gates." Here ends this first reading. Thanks be to God for these words of life.
Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Just then, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." He answered, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord. Even dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. When I said yes to Pastor Mike's request to preach this week, I had no idea how hard that would be. To be clear, the hard part wasn't the topic, women, or the process. I've been preaching and writing sermons now for 20 more and plus years. But the hard part came when I was asked to pick my own text. You see, for the last 20 years, I've been using the Revised Common Lectionary, which means if some small conclave 40 years ago said I was supposed to preach on John's philosophical meanderings on the bread of life, well, I was in for it. Apologies to Pastor Rob across the street, who is preaching on exactly that this Sunday. I did have a pretty good sermon planned on the text I sent to Pastor Mike, but Pastor Mike then sent me your weekly email blast, and I saw the series title, Roar, and I just had to change tracks. Because as much as it might be helpful to talk about how women have struggled throughout biblical times and how in the continuing days they still have to prove themselves worthy, it is perhaps more important on this, the last Sunday of your series, to share a story of what happens when a woman already knows she's worthy, when she uses her voice, when she roars. The story begins last year when I signed up to attend an evangelical preaching conference at the Calvin Institute in northern Michigan. The Calvin Institute is a bastion of the Christian Reformed tradition, a denomination known for its robust singing, literal interpretation of Scripture, and general antipathy towards progressivism, including women's leadership in the church. So I wasn't surprised that though this was a conference about novels and what they can teach us about the human condition, not a single page of the 1,000 pages assigned was written by a woman. When I emailed the department secretary to see if there had been a mistake, She responded that the conference was only 5 days long and that they, quote, couldn't cover everything. So, of course, I contacted the Hinsdale Public Library and packed a whole laundry basket full of books by women so that maybe we could get a little closer to covering everything, and drove up to Michigan hoping for the best. Let me just say, the Calvin Institute still stands. I am still here too, but I wasn't wrong to prepare. The professors had planned a pretty traditional class following a pretty traditional form, one they hadn't changed for 20 years. It was mostly centered on men and men's experiences. Every day I found myself needing to explain something about women. On Grapes of Wrath Day, I explained that the waitress in the story might not feel safe enough to offer compassion when lewd jokes were being bantered about. On LBJ Biography Day, I encouraged us to consider Ladybird's feelings on some of the things that were going on. On Poetry Day, I offered that men and women often grieve differently. And on Children's Literature Day, I opined that strict predestination could lead us to conclude that evils like cancer and ecological collapse, misogyny, homophobia, and anti-Semitism are part of God's plan. And then I went a step further and pointed out that it is never a good idea to mistake the acts of Hitler for the acts of God. The professor just stared at me. Evenings, I'd call my husband Jay with my day's report, closing with the refrain, "So I am making friends." Everyone was generally polite. Christian reform nice was out in full measure. But I'm sure some of my classmates may have been tempted to call me some of those names that people traditionally use for upstart women. Names like Jesus uses in today's gospel. Today's gospel lesson is a hard one, maybe the hardest in the whole Bible. Jesus is approached by a woman wanting to explain something to him about her daughter's human condition, but he turns on her and he calls her a dog. It isn't nice. Biblical apologists valiantly try to redeem Jesus' words. One commentary I read even claimed that maybe he's really calling her a puppy, but that's not much better. The fact of the matter is this: in the ancient world, calling a woman a dog is just as bad as doing that today. Some interpreters claim Jesus used a crude phrase as a test for his disciples, but honestly, I like that even less. Better to be a dog than a living object lesson for your betters. Now, there is a time and a place for profanity. I tell my children it's college. But my tradition's founder, 16th century monk Martin Luther, made ample use of it. You should read some of the things he said about his theological enemies. While I don't necessarily condone the way Luther talked about the Pope, I do understand that tone policing can be the last refuge of tyrants. Nevertheless, I can't help but wonder if all this crude talk tees up the disciples' callous response. Much like the waitress in Grapes of Wrath, they couldn't find their way to compassion. When a non-Jewish woman comes asking for Jesus' help in a very real need, the disciples don't hope for a miracle. They ask Jesus to send her away. I don't know if any of my classmates asked for me to be sent away. A covenant pastor told me at our very first dinner together that he didn't think every book or article was about feminism. I think he was a little surprised when I told him that I didn't think so either. I continued, but we should talk about women characters in books and articles and analyze those descriptions and decide whether or not they help us understand the human condition. On that, we could agree. Jesus tells the woman he doesn't think his mission is about Canaanites. The lost sheep of Israel are a pretty good big group for any Messiah to manage. God's been doing things this way for thousands of years. Why change now? And yet the woman is undeterred. She takes Jesus' dog insult and turns it on its head. If the bread is for the children, isn't it possible that dogs can get some crumbs? Is that too much to ask the master? Surely not. I have to admit, I'm blown away by the Canaanite woman's intelligence, her tenacity, her roar, her humility. In a moment of dire need, she thinks on her feet, laying out all she has for the sake of the daughter she loves. But this isn't the only gift the Canaanite woman has. The Canaanite woman also has her faith. Somewhere deep in her memory, somewhere past even her own experience of space and time, she knows a truth about God. She knows the prophecy Isaiah proclaims, that God would gather not just God's own people, but all nations to himself. She knows the promise that St. Paul will espouse, that God would be merciful to everyone. She knows that even though she has never read the Bible, never stepped foot in a synagogue, never known the law or the prophets, she knows this even though she has never answered an altar call, taken communion, she was never even baptized. The Canaanite woman lets Jesus call her a dog. Yes, that's fine. But she turns the words in on themselves. If she's a dog, she gets the scraps, right? Jesus can spare a crumb, can't he? Because that's the God she believes in. No wonder Jesus calls her faith great. Martin Luther, remember, 16th century monk, writes this: "So she catches Christ, the Lord, in his own words, and with that wins not only the right of a dog, but also that of the children. Now then, where will he go, our dear Jesus? He has let himself be made captive and must comply. But be sure of this is what he most deeply desires. By such tenacity and unflinching faith, the Lord is taken captive and pressed to answer. O woman, you cling firmly to the hope that I will help you, and don't let go of me." The Canaanite woman's faith, her roar, was great enough for her to get her miracle. But she wasn't the only one. I have to admit, there was something bold in the idea of a preaching seminar at Calvin College. While the reading selections might have betrayed a bias, the makeup of the class did not. In my group of 20, 50% of us were men and 50% were women. And while there were plenty of Christian Reformed folks and Presbyterians, there were also Anglicans, Methodists, even a Roman Catholic lay preacher in attendance. And I wasn't the only one there who offered important insights on the human condition. On Grapes of Wrath Day, a Presbyterian pastor talked about climate change. On LBJ Biography Day, a Covenant pastor talked about his own grief over his divided congregation. On Children's Literature Day, we ended up talking a lot about the Barbie movie. One Anglican was pretty sure it wasn't for children, while another was pretty sure it was. On Poetry Day, I learned that even Christian Reformed traditions struggle with whether or not flags belong in sanctuaries. And on the last day, the lay Catholic preacher made sure I had her phone number. Turns out I made friends after all. On the last day of class, the department secretary, that same one who'd sent me the first email, told me she'd overheard the professor saying they'd never heard comments like mine before, and that it was a really good thing I had come. "I'm saving your name tag," she said conspiratorially. "I hope you'll be back." And here's the twist. The hero of the story, the person most like the Canaanite woman, the one who roared best, I think wasn't me, but that department secretary. Her faith was great. Her faith was so great that as much as she loved her own tradition, as much as she felt called to her particular sheep and her particular pasture, she loved Jesus more. And it made a difference. Even when I pushed her, she responded not with crude words, but with grace and hope. A quieter sort of roar, perhaps, but effective. It turned out it was she who had selected the participants, who brought together a group of diverse pastors to talk about preaching and the human condition. She pushed past a 20-year-old curriculum she couldn't change and found her own way of opening it up to a whole new way of thinking. It was she who assured me I hadn't gone too far and should come back. She took crumbs of possibility and made them into a rich feast for all. I'll go further and say I think Union's bold idea to open your pulpit and Redeemer's bold idea to accept the invitation fit this pattern too. Each of us feels called to our particular sheep and our particular pasture, and yet we rolled with it, though none of us knew what might happen or how many times the guest preacher might change her mind about texts. There are certainly issues on which we differ, but we love Jesus more. We love Jesus enough to be sometimes uncomfortable, to have our certainties challenged, to change the way we've always done things, to dare new things. We do it to make room for more voices, more songs, more scriptures, more ways to tell the story, more ways to learn and grow together. And that, my friends, is an example of what heaven looks like, right here on earth. Perhaps we can continue in this way, here at Union and beyond, boldly inviting, prayerfully opening, attentively listening, insistently welcoming, even Canaanites and Calvinists, even Lutheran lady pastors, even those who watch different news channels or vote for different candidates or pray in another way. Perhaps our faith can be great enough that we will make room for a miracle. Healing for our church, the world, our neighbors, and ourselves. Thanks be to God for bold women, bold people, bold churches who insist on loving God above all else and who roar. And thanks be to Jesus who offers us more than crumbs, but miracles beyond our wildest expectations. Thanks be to God. Amen.